Some of it's aggressive, but some of it would be passive too, wouldn't it? I think it would be generally difficult to change. And so, as we've seen, they haven't really tried to change the culture. They've just established separate groups and they've kept them quite separate. Goodness. What else? It's alive. Anything else that we can say about it? Yep. So, okay. New, old. Oops. So the conflict has somewhat eroded their values because you've got different sets of values being used in the same organisation. And in relation particularly to values, you could imagine that inconsistency creates a lot of disruption. You can probably cope more with differences at the behavioural level. Oh, marketing behaves like that and R&D behaves like that. We know that, that's all right. But we've all got the same core values. When the difference is too great, then the values must be different, and that's when real conflict would arise. So, what has that meant? What has been the consequence of this from a strategic drift perspective? We saw this when, what was he, Wise Jack or, no, Saviour or Saint, is it Jack? Saint Matt, no, what's his name, Saint Anthony, yes, Saint Anthony, thank you, very good. When Saint Anthony came in and said, okay, we're going to clean up, we're going to sort of move back towards our traditional culture, what happened to the organisation's performance? Yep, it went down because of cultural drift. Because it's good, right? Bank, reliable, ethical, consistent, everyone gives you the same story, you know what you're getting, that's all good, right? But it's not really enough. And it's enough to keep them in business, because some people say, I don't care, I'll take a low interest rate if it's an ethical bank. But a lot of people say, oh, I get a better interest rate elsewhere, so they're not performing as well, they're not aggressive enough, I can't bank with them. So their market share, their performance was diminishing. So the old culture was less So the old culture in the traditional parts of the bank was leading to lower levels of performance than the very aggressive, if highly risky, investment section of the bank. So the strategic drift was very evident in this organisation because you had the new segments that were right on the money, tax evasion, investment, wealth building, the latest stuff. And they made lots of money most of the time, except where they made big mistakes, in which case it wasn't due to the fact that it was the wrong strategy, but was just due to the fact that it wasn't properly implemented. And then they had the traditional bit, which was very consistent and very dependable, but not very profitable. So, as we said, strategic drift drift in the old bank segment. So there was strategic drift for the traditional part of their bank. And that was the problem. And that was indeed why Diamond Bob introduced the new section, because he could see that the traditional banking segment was not going to provide them with the performance that they required, that he as the CEO was required to deliver. So, and he wasn't going to take the old segment of the bank into a new area. It was too difficult to change. 200 years, he didn't have the time or patience for that. So he introduced some new segments where he could have a different culture that was a higher performance culture for the current environment. So this is a classic example of moving along. The market's going this way, or the environment's going this way. The bank's trying to keep up. It's introducing ATMs and things, but eventually the gap gets so big, and then there's just a quantum step up to where you need to be for the market. And in this instance, the quantum step was by introducing new divisions with completely different behaviours, but also with some challenges. And probably one of the most significant is in something like the banking industry, it probably takes a long time to get banking right. You can't just say, right, we're going to open a bank and it's going to work really well. You need to start small, slowly build your way up. So if they had started the investment banking process a decade or two earlier, then when the period of time that we're looking at arrived, they would have been ready to be in investment banking. It would take that sort of period of time to get it right. But because they just tried to attach it to the organisation, essentially it's an acquisition, simply tried to acquire that capability in a very compressed way, then there was limited control, and their ability to come up with the right culture, with the right systems and rules and regulations was too weak, and they weren't able to deliver it properly. So the strategy of moving into investment banking was probably very sound, but the implementation was influenced by the fact that the culture of the traditional component was not able to change enough for them to go into investment banking, so they looked for the quick hit of just saying we'll have a new section in the bank and a new culture from scratch. But then they lost, as we talked about earlier on, when you've got a new rapidly changing dynamic culture, because you just said, look, we just bought a new building, now we put some office chairs in there and some desks, now we're getting some people. It's too unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen because you haven't had the benefit of building up the culture to create consistent and coherent behaviour. And so everyone would have been saying, oh, the value is, doesn't matter, the customer's always right. It's illegal, we're going to do it anyway, because as long as we can get away with it, it doesn't matter. And another person says, no, we can't break the law, that's ridiculous. My values say we mustn't do that. And so you'd have all of these random behaviours going on in the one division because they hadn't had the time to build it up. So it's a classic example of mismatch between the strategy and the culture, and the consequences of time compression, diseconomies of scale, when you try and do something fast, it's going to cost you a lot of money and it's going to have a lot of problems associated with it. If you do it slowly and over the correct period of time, and you can spend 10 years or 15 years doing it, then it won't be as expensive, but you have to wait 10 or 15 years. And if you can't wait 10 or 15 years, then that's the real problem. Diamond Bob couldn't wait 10 or 15 years because he was employed to make the bank perform better. And you saw what happened when St Anthony took over and cleaned things up, got the culture, created a more consistent culture and removed some of the lack of control and excess. The board wasn't happy with the consequent performance, and then he eventually got kicked out purely because he tried to bring strategy back in line with the culture. But the problem was that what was left of the strategy when they aligned with the culture was not good enough to get the performance they required. So he was also caught up by the time-based diseconomies of scale. He, in that period of time, wasn't able to introduce sufficiently aggressive banking to enable them to perform well. Yep.
With Diamond Bob's strategy, like you wanted to gain a
Yes. Yeah.
And he was successful in doing that. Like, let's say somewhere around 58% of Barclays.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. So the strategy was good. Yes. But the problem was with the implementation, that in order to do that, they moved into unethical areas, which a bank cannot do. And the strategy was not to be unethical. The strategy was to move into those areas, but the lack of control that resulted from the lack of a solid, consistent, developed culture was what basically pushed them into unethical behaviours. I couldn't imagine it, well, I could imagine some CEOs, but very few CEOs are going to say, right, what we need is unethical behaviours. Right? You just don't do that. It's just an absolute recipe for disaster. Anyone with any experience will know that overt approach. Now, lack of control, reliance on appropriate... You're a banker, for heaven's sakes, don't behave unethically. That's the expectation, but not when you just start everything from scratch and just throw it all together and just say, just go for it. Then the traditions, the rules, the expectations, the consistency isn't there. So that's what was wrong. And it's very much an implementation issue, and it's very much, as I said, due to the fact that they didn't have the time to develop the culture that would enable them to do a good enough job in that area, and still and have the level of control that was expected from the banking industry. If they had been lucky enough to do it, they probably would have found that they would have they would have had a lower level of performance, but they would have had a high level of integrity. And they would have been able to meet the integrity requirements of the banking industry and be consistent enough with the rest of the culture of the organisation, but still improve more by moving into a new area. So it's quite possible to achieve these things, but as I said, you can't just do it overnight. You have to see these things coming. So a clever bank would have predicted this in the 1950s and moved on in the 1960s and been ready in the mid-1970s to be a significant player in the investment industry, because all the hallmarks were already there back at that time. But instead they just tried to do it that way, and that was the issue. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Path dependency. I think this is what is going wrong with this? If I move the mouse, it jumps to the next slide. Path dependency, technology. Anything much in the case about technology? Did technology constrain what happened? Not really. I didn't see much evidence of that. They obviously used technology, but did it create a path dependency? Did it drive them in a particular direction? No. Possibly e-commerce. No, I'll just put that in. Why am I saying e-commerce? It wasn't really in the case, so it's a bit of an extension. But what does e-commerce bring about? So in the 1920s, what banks did you deal with, even if you were rich? In the 1940s, for that matter, 1950s. How did you decide on what bank you're going to deal with? You want to invest your money? You want good return? What did you do? Savings? Yes, but in terms of which bank you dealt with? Well, you dealt with your local bank, because there was no other way of banking. You had to physically go there. Right? You had to physically go there with your bag of money and say, I've got a bag of money, or maybe, a little more sophisticated, I've got a cheque, but that's about it. It was all physically managed. So, therefore, they had captive markets. And you may not have been the best investment bank, but people are going to still stick with you because you were their local bank. Or, you were sufficiently, maybe you had a national business and that bank was present all around the country, so it was really easy to deal with you. So we're just dealing with them because they're local for us, and we don't have people driving around the country with bags of money everywhere, so we're stuck with that. Then you bring in e-commerce, and what happens? You can invest your money anywhere. It's all electronic transfer. It's mostly quick, still about 3 days, which is pretty pathetic when you think about it. But you can invest your money pretty much anywhere. So that increased their level of competition that they experienced. So I think technology created a path dependency which said that they had to be internationally competitive rather than locally competitive. There's 2 banks side by side in the main street. One offers 5% return on investment and one offers 3%. Which one's getting all the business? 5%. If there's 2 banks in the world that are both dependable and one offers 5% and one offers 3%, guess who's getting all the business? Now electronically. So there's been a bit of path dependency effect there from technology by bringing them into a global competition context. But that would have been around for, oh, well, not that long, really. I guess 15 years, which is a pretty short period of time in banking language. Not a lot of international investment would have occurred before the early 1990s. Most people wouldn't have been brave enough to invest in you probably wouldn't. I would invest in Swiss banks, but did you invest in a German bank from Australia? Probably not. Really hard to transfer the money, really hard to know what's going on. So yeah, really just e-commerce has brought that in. Okay, objects. Anything much from objects? Equipment, documents, locations, probably not much really. So no. Whoop. Oh, come on. Behaviour. Was there a path dependency effect? The big one. This is the big one. Because what was the path dependency for people in the traditional parts of the bank? Conservative. Very good. Thank you. And in, oh, that's all capitals. Something like that. And in the investment section, aggressive, yes. Still left it on. Okay, so aggressive in the investment section. So completely different behaviours. They both followed their own path. The culture such as it was, and there's always, as we discussed, a culture in place, in the investment section was make money. Whatever it takes, make money. Whereas in the traditional section, the path dependency was from the culture was very much whatever it takes to be consistent with what we've done for the last 200 years. Good. Training. Not really much evidence, but the individual groups, the people who work in the traditional section were trained in the traditional section. Whereas the people who came into the investment section were all new employees because it was a new division. A few people were poached, but mainly they came from elsewhere. So their training came from different cultural contexts. So I remember in the case it said Diamond Bob brought in some of his colleagues. Was it Diamond Bob who brought in colleagues from one of the banks? The last one. So those people had been trained in different environments. So and that's obviously what he wanted, but the point was that their training as to how you do things came from that particular environment. And we frequently find that when you bring someone into an organisation and you want them to do some significant things and make some changes, they'll have a set of expectations. And they'll say, well, we'll do this now. And then the people in that organisation will say, no, you can't do that. And they'll say, why? this is what I was trained to do. This is the way we do it. No, we don't do it that way here. That's the way it's done where you were, but there's different rules. So, for example, if you're an HR manager and you come from the US, where you can pay people to do work outside hours, homework and piecework and things like that, work at home stuff, that's completely legitimate and it's a common component of HR practices in the US. And you go to a country like Germany where it's actually illegal to do that. You are trained to establish HR systems to take advantage of this, and your training would lead you to choose to do behaviours that are simply illegal in the different context. So the cultural impact of the context in which you're trained is significant. So we had people coming from different areas, and their training would also have brought in different sets of behaviours and different sets of expectations. Standards and rules, absolutely. We had one set of standards and rules for the people in the traditional component and different standards and obviously rules for the investment. Okay, turn that off. Why is it turning off? And finally, the value systems, same, isn't it? Because we can imagine the values of the people in the investment section are different. And we discussed the fact that they would be more oriented towards, the people in the investment area, their personal values would be more oriented towards short-term returns, high level of customer focus, and long-term concerns for the future. Perhaps, well, look, I'm only going to be in this bank for 2 years, then I'm moving on, I'm going to start my own investment agency. That's the sort of logic, thinking, values that these people would have, versus the people in the traditional sector who said, well, actually, I'm proud to say I'm the 4th generation member of this bank. My father, grandfather, great-grandmother all spent their entire career in the bank, and that's what I'm planning to do too. So you can see very different values. Cultural web. We pretty much knocked this one off, so I'll just get through the cultural web quite quickly because we've only got about 30 minutes or so for the other case, which I want to have a look at as well. Symbols. I imagine the traditional bank was full of symbols. They would have had the big edifice, the traditional Christmas function. They would have been filled with symbols and rituals. So. Okay, what about the symbols in the investment section? Where would they have come from? They wouldn't have had much chance. They would have had a flash logo, probably new office building, lots of chrome, glass, common work areas, lots of modern signs. Where would all of this have come from? Would these have been, developed from the influences within the bank, or would they come from somewhere else, these symbols? Yeah, they would have come from external sources. So the investment section, they were basically imported. That obviously says investment section. I'll move this thing down. They would have imported most of the symbols from the broad investment industry rather than being Barclay Bank symbols. Now, some of the Barclay Bank traditional symbols would have been originally probably external, but so long ago that people probably forgotten it's been fully absorbed. But certainly all the new symbols, the glass offices, the open working spaces, the flashy display of money and so forth would have all been borrowed from the external market, and there would have been no consistency amongst those things. They would have just been a random set of symbols. So it's like if you purchased a new house and you said, right, I'm going to get some furniture. So I'm going to buy some from IKEA and I'm going to buy some from, Nick Scully, he's another furniture provider. I'll get some on eBay, and it's just going to mix. They're all external influences, and each item might be very nice, but they don't go together to create any sense of what's going on there. There's no consistency amongst them. They're incompatible. So in the same way, just acquiring a lot of symbols externally and bringing them in even won't lead to any sense of consistency. So on one hand, I've got a big leather chair. On the other hand, I've got an open workspace. On one hand, I'm given a technology that enables me to work at home, but I'm told I have to be at the office all the time. So I've got these conflicting messages. I don't really understand what's going on because the symbols that are around me are borrowed from other sources, so they're not consistent. Whereas if you build up the set of symbols, then it's like building up your furniture. Right, I'm just going to buy this one chair. Okay, I've got the idea. All right, I've seen some other furniture that goes with that chair. I'll get that. That's now I'm slowly building this consistency. And you think, I don't know, what's a good example? Of a traditional library with book-lined walls and maybe a fireplace, and obviously this is traditional for my cultural background, and big leather chairs and so forth. Everything's consistent. It all has the same message of slowness and peace and earnestness about it, right? So everything in that environment is consistent. But if I've got a big screen with Bloomberg News blaring and a fire going and I don't know, maybe an indoor garden, then I don't know what this is all about. There's these just mixed messages. Am I supposed to be relaxing in front of the fire? Am I supposed to be natural and looking at the garden? Or am I supposed to be staring at what's happening in the US on the screen? I can't tell. Those symbols aren't leading me to have an understanding of what that space is supposed to be about. So in the investment section, the newness would have again led towards that disharmony in terms of the symbols because they would have been borrowed. Power structures, probably nothing very much other than the fact that there was a high degree of silo and there was no sharing of traditional values across the boundaries. They were just separated because the cultures were so different. Same for this. Separating out meant that there was no possibility for cross-contagion. And again, in an optimal situation where perhaps they had been managing the development of the investment section over a longer period of time, so they were able to build the symbols and the culture and so forth and the values in a way that was sufficiently consistent and controlled, then they may have used that to provide some contagion to the rest of the bank and thought, look, everyone could be a little bit more aggressive in the bank, and so we'll make sure that there's a bit of carryover from our more aggressive behaviour in our well-designed investment section into our more traditional personal savings section. How would you do that? How would you get contagion between the two sections if you wanted that? Pretty simple. You get them together, get some cross-learning, get secondments, swap people from in either direction. So, look, you need to learn a bit more from our investment section. They're a good group of people, and they do some really interesting things that you're not doing. And you could do some of this in savings. You don't need to be quite so limited. So let's swap a few of our investment managers around and so forth, and we'll get a bit of contagion and spread it around. That way the two cultures would end up sort of becoming even more similar over time. So dividing them, keeping them separate, you get traditional fireplace type environment with the leather furniture and the fires and the books, and you've got the glass high-rise office with the open workspace, and you never meet. Then there's no potential for crossover and sharing of capabilities or culture. Control systems. What was the control system like in the traditional section, do you think? Yep. Let's just say high. It's high. Okay. In the invest section, the control was... What was the control in the investment section? That's generous. Anyone else? I'll just say low. It was individualistic, but that could be okay. Because if you had a bunch of artists, for example, you'd say, I really need you to be doing different things. This is what I really want. If you're all doing the same stuff, I don't need that. Just have some assistants who copy your work. So I want you to do sculpture, and I want you to do painting. I want you to be impressionist. I want you to be way out there. I want you to do electronic art. I want you to do e-art. You want them to be doing very different things and bringing new ideas in. So individualistic is not by any means bad. But low control in an industry where control is important because it's finance and intrinsically high levels of control are required, that's an issue. So two different types of control systems, that's an issue. Rituals and routines, as for symbols, stories, probably as above. Yep. So where would the stories come from in the investment section? Everyone's new, but they're sharing stories, they're having lunch. I remember the time when. Where do these stories come from? Other banks, other cultures, other contexts. So they would be sharing, just like the furniture example I gave before, they would be sharing inconsistent stories that supported the formation of different values. So they'd just be creating chaos in the value set. Yeah, remember that story about someone who managed to rort the tax system and make lots of money and was really successful? It's pretty good, wasn't it? But aren't we a traditional bank? Shouldn't we be about key values? Yeah, I wonder which is the right value for us to... That would just create confusion rather than consistency. So, in conclusion, we can say what? I'll start you going with the easiest thing. So we've got two subcultures. What else? Yes. But not nature. Well, let's be more specific. Clearly the behaviours are different, but is it more than that? Again? No, I just can't quite hear you because of the distance. Interests, did you say? Yeah. Interests, yes. Yep, okay. So that's sort of a bit like beliefs, I guess. Can we, I'm sort of nudging you in a particular direction. How far is this difference going to go? Is it just behaviours? Is it a bit deeper? Values? Or is it, or is it beliefs or is it values? Behaviours, beliefs, values. Certainly, I think as far as beliefs go, but I could see even you could argue values, because the traditional bank is all about long-term commitment to the market over generations, and about stability and predictability, and not about performance. Because we've seen every time they went back to the traditional culture, performance was down low. Whereas the other culture was all about short-term return, individual gain, short-term personal gain, as opposed to stability, and individualisation, I guess. So I think you could probably say that you could mount a fair argument that it was conflicting even at the values level. Certainly the beliefs. Great. All right, that's done. Any questions or comments? Pretty straightforward. The secret with these things is to think about it a little bit. Try and put yourself there, absorb it, imagine what's going on, try and understand. What I always like to say, the moral of the story, whenever you look at any strategy type event, there's usually one big thing going on. Strategy is not usually comprised of a million small things. There's usually one or two big dominant things, and usually there's one thing that interests you. So here what interests us is that there were two different segments put into the bank that did not fit together. And when we use the cultural perspective, what we need to do is look at the differences. That's really where I was coming at this one. I thought, this is different. You've got investment people and the traditional people. They're entirely different. Everything's different about them, the way this has been set up. So no matter what perspective I'm going to take on this story, this event, this case, this issue, this problem, I'm going to think about it in terms of the differences between the two groups, because that's the real thing that's gone on here. So always look for the key thing that's going on. Don't get caught in all the different details. Try and say, what's going on here? Well, you've got these people bringing some new stuff in that they don't traditionally do. So that's all about making rapid change. So what does that mean in terms of culture or implementation or anything? So that's how you drive this. And that's how you sort all of the discussion from this discussion, the stuff that you're really interested in. Good. All right. So I'll just save that one. Come on, mouse. And we'll get rid of that. And now let's... this is actually a funny title for the case. It's Drinking Partners. Is it about alcohol? Does anyone remember this one? Bit of a stretch. What's it about? Yeah, so it's a story of what's the big event, what happened. It took like many years for this to happen, but what unfolded in the case. To work it out, we can have a simple time-based description. Where does the case start? What happens at the beginning of the case or the period of time that the case applies to? What's the first event? If you do a little timeline and you put in, key things that happened, what was the first event that happened? No, that's way down the track. What happened at the beginning? Disintegration. Did you? Yeah, I would just think of the simple events. What's gone on here? Anyone? No? A son inherited a big, successful, very traditional business from his dad, and he had a lot of money to spend on pretty much whatever he liked to. He could sell lots of income, lots of assets, and what he chose to do was do what? What did he choose to do? Okay, I think lack of case familiarity here. First thing he did was bought an airline. Remember? Now, that's not much to do with what they did. So he went off and said, you know what? you're great to buy an airline. You can't go wrong with buying an airline, can you? You know, it's prestige, it's where it's all at, the market's developed. We should have an airline. Buy a big one. There's quite a decent one going for sale. I get a good deal on that. I know the people. I'm going to buy an airline because I know everything about airlines. I've been on a plane, so he bought an airline. Then what did he do? What was the next big event? Yes, he bought a major international spirits manufacturer, White and something or other. So again, he'd know all about the UK spirits industry, wouldn't he? Right? So quite dramatic strategic decisions to diversify into very new and different industries. So these are the key events. So what's this story about, Ben? How to lose lots of money? Yeah, that's a good suggestion. What else is it about? Bad decision making? Yeah, can we refine that a bit? What sort of decision making? He wasn't thinking carefully, yeah. He was very, very opportunistic, wasn't he? What was he being opportunistic about? Diversification. So this was very what we call unrelated diversification, just jumping off into new areas. And the point that you made is that the story is about the risks associated with unrelated diversification. Now, we don't really know from the case. We can guess from the flamboyant lifestyle of the CEO, the son who inherited the business, that probably this was pretty unprepared. But maybe he had spent years observing these industries and really felt, you know, quite convinced. We don't know. It doesn't really matter terribly because the reality is one person, you might have a few well-established ideas, but that's hardly enough to make a difference with a diversification like that. So whether it was the result of extensive planning and turned out badly, or whether it was a very random and poorly thought out decision, in many ways doesn't make any difference. It's the ability of the organisation to cater for that. Okay, so sometimes you get away with that and you'll think, you know, we should go into this area. Wow, that works so well. And because you were just lucky the organisation was able to cope with that and that it eventuated in the way you expected. But you could just as easily spend a huge amount of effort planning and organising it and then fail dismally. Because unrelated diversification has so much uncertainty in terms of whether it will actually give what you expect and whether the organisation can actually do it. So we've got two examples of unrelated diversification which resulted from what was probably pretty unlimited strategic thinking. But as I said, the more significant component of this is the fact that they were so different rather than who brought them about. Okay, so the perspective we're taking on this is strategic purpose. What is the purpose of this organisation, and is that the cause of the problem? In the same way that we looked at the cultural clash in the last case. Here we're looking about whether the acquisitions were sufficiently consistent with the purpose of the rest of the organisation that they could live together, or whether they were about wildly divergent things. And so basically that meant that the organisation, when it acquired the airline, had doubled its purpose. And when it acquired the whisky company, it had tripled the size of its purpose. And of course, when you increase your purpose, or your objectives or your outcomes, what happens? You lose focus. And competitiveness usually results from what in relation to focus? If you're a successful Olympic athlete, what is one of the things that you do? You train, of course. You do lots of things. You run a couple of businesses, you go out drinking a lot, you got a big social network, you do all sorts of stuff. Are those the characteristics of a successful Olympic athlete, or perhaps a Commonwealth Games athlete to be more to be more contemporary? You focus. You are super focused on the key things. So the less focus an organisation has, the more it spreads its resources across achieving more things. So by introducing new divisions or new businesses, then it's increased the number of things it needs to focus on, and it spreads itself more thinly across all of those. And that's the issue with unrelated diversification: airlines, alcohol, manufacturing. If, however, it's just in one industry, it can remain very focused. But of course, then there's a high level of risk, because if things aren't too good in that industry, that's it. You've got nowhere else to go. So there's always a trade-off with these things. So businesses always need a degree of related and unrelated diversification to cover environmental trends and enable them to be reasonably focused at the same time. But here we had an excess of unrelated investment in terms of quantity and time frame. So, factors affecting the strategic purpose. Ownership. What sort of ownership? We got shareholders, stakeholders, family ownership. What sort of ownership have we got? Really?
He wasn't a major shareholder.
Did the case even mention the family? I think they got a slight mention. So no, he owns it. Sole ownership. So great when you're starting up a small business. I own it. I am in complete control. I can do what we need to do. I've got to do most of the work myself anyway, so that works really well. And absolutely dangerous when it's a billion-dollar organisation, because too much freedom for choice. Very hard for people to resist. When you own the place, you own the place. So it's very difficult for you to say, I won't do what I think, I'll do what someone else tells me. So, sole ownership. Governance. What was the governance system like? Didn't get a lot in the case, but we did get a little bit about the board. You'll remember that he was very careful to make sure that he had a majority stakeholder. He lost it through loss of profitability, but the objective was always to have a majority stakeholding in all investments, which meant that they had a high degree of control, which meant decision making was centralised. They didn't, if you had 3 different groups each owning 1/3, then all decisions would need to be consensus decisions. No one would be in charge. So the governance would be spread and would be conciliatory, whereas in this instance, with a controlling owner, they get to dictate what happens. So it was very, anyone want to work out what the word is? Good, very good. The governance was very centralised. You had sole ownership and majority shareholding as well. If it was sole ownership of the organisation but it didn't have majority shareholding, then the effect would be considerably diluted. If it had majority shareholding but there wasn't a sole owner, a family or a board or a trust or shareholders, then again the effect would be, there would be much less of a centralised effect. But here we've got, in many cases, the worst situation in terms of getting things right or wrong, because you've got one person who not only is in charge, but also has the majority control as well. So gives them a huge amount of power. Stakeholders. Well, we know who they are, but who affects the strategic purpose? Who else? We know there was some influence, right, because the increasing demand for air flights in China, in India, meant that there was some demand, and that clearly influenced the behaviours. But few other stakeholders influence the organisational purpose. Okay, social responsibility. No evidence in the case of that at all. He wasn't trying to improve. He didn't say, I have to do this to save this ailing airline because India needs more airlines if we're going to, be successful as a major economic power. We need a lot of airlines, and I can prop this one up, and that'll be good, and it'll help us. None of that. This was all about, I think it'd be fun to own some planes. So social responsibility very low. So massive focus on individualised control and central control and limited consequences. All right, that was a pretty straightforward one. So the mission. We're actually told these. The case doesn't mention the mission or the vision in any real way. But we can still reflect on the evidence that we've seen. What do we see about the mission? It was traditionally about providing what? What was the traditional version, the father's version, if you like? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Provide quality service. It was a bit like Barclays Bank, wasn't it? Fairly traditional, quality service, dependability, stability, reliability, nothing too new, trying to be at the front end, but just trying to do what they did well. So, good. How did that change effectively, even if not literally? In other words, the behaviours, how did that change? Yeah, so they were quite concerned with growth. Growth and change. So let's just do different things, let's grow whatever looks exciting at the time. So a move away from value and being opportunistic. All right, good. The vision. So if the mission is the long-term, is the medium-term thing, what you do in the next year or two, the vision is the long-term thing. What's the new long-term vision? Any ideas? Do you think he had one? I don't think so. His whole lifestyle was about live for the day, immediacy, his profile. He didn't have a long-term view. He wasn't talking about in 20 years' time this is going to be a great investment. In 20 years' time we will move from alcohol to transportation. There was no long-term view. Values. So we had the traditional values already. We already had that. What were the new values? Well, it's probably a mix, wasn't there? We still had the original part of the company would have maintained its existing values, but that was sold down. the other parts that they'd acquired, the airline and the whisky company, would have had their own values. Oh, dear goodness. So yes, so we would have had this combination of some traditional values which were resident in a shrinking part of the organisation, and just new values that just came in with other divisions. And again, the same as the issue that we had with Barclays Bank, a real conflict between these instead of, and which meant that sharing and so forth was not going to be possible. Objectives. What's objective? The new objective. Anyone? Growth. Growth and diversification. Okay, good. All right, so generally introducing less stability, less consistency, that's fine. You've got to make change. If there is a vision, could be fine. But because there was no vision, the disruption associated with bringing in different sets of values from acquisitions, from having objectives of growth, which is about change rather than establishing rule-based systems and the rest of it, meant that it's more likely to have brought in instability. Well, it would have brought in instability, which would have been likely to have countered any benefit that would have resulted from the diversification. So external stakeholders, economic stakeholders, we didn't see any real issue there other than he ran out of money. What about socio-political? Was there anything going on there? Yep. Sorry? Last?
They were unable to pay the employees overtasked to shut down.
Yep. So the government intervened in some of their activities, requiring them to shut down because they were not behaving sufficiently socially responsibly. What else? Technological? Nothing really. Community. What was the attitude towards the community? That's an interesting one. Indeed, but I mean, in terms of their impact, because he was a significant employer, his impact on staff, on the economy, on their industries. Really took advantage, but no return. He didn't build anything. He didn't build a better industry. He didn't build a better airline industry. He didn't provide better employment. He took advantage of acquisitions, didn't run them very effectively, didn't provide a return. So organisations have a responsibility when they have access to assets, is to make them work effectively and efficiently. Unfortunately, we've sort of run out of time to look at the last two tables, but very quickly, if we looked at the governance model, we would have seen that in this instance, it's very much a shareholder model, stakeholders that have little say, and of course very centralised shareholder being just the owner. So mostly it was about disadvantages, which was too much power, ability to make decisions without consideration of the performance or responsibility benefits. And in terms of stakeholder mapping, we saw the power was very high, but the level of interest in actual fact was very low. He would have just happily gone and acquired more and more businesses because it was lots of fun. So, and that was a very unfortunate position to